and welcome to our Watchlist 2024 Outlook. And joining me today is BlondeMoney's Helen Thomas. Thank you for joining us. We're going to run through everything around our watchlist for 2024 now. In this, of course, we look at everything from central banks to the US elections to the rise of the far right in Europe and everything in between. It's a broad brush approach to the next year. We're trying to touch on lots of themes. And the overriding theme, of course, is one of conflict and the rise of a multipolar world. We heard a lot from global central banks last year or through 2023 about fragmentation, about deglobalization. Those are very much the themes that we're looking at in our watch list, which you can download on the website. And what we're going to do now with Helen and her unique expertise is just run through some of these themes and try and explain a bit more about them and get your take on what's going on, because I know it's not necessarily going to be exactly the same. And that's part of the fun, of course, as well, is that everyone's got their own views, and that's what drives the market. So first of all, the global economy and avoiding a hard landing. So do you think we avoid the hard landing? Do you think we thread the needle into a soft landing? I know in my take, it's sort of very much that the risks are towards the hard landing, but we could end up with a slightly softer landing, but it's all a bit unknown at the moment.
Well, I mean, yeah, to look back for 1 second at this year, the story has been the absence of the hard landing, hasn't it? Because so many of us were expecting that, and we just sort of kept seeing it delayed. And it's important to reflect on why that was the case as we look to next year, I think. Now, it depends a bit what country you're in, but broadly, I agree that all of those interest rate hikes, tightening of conditions, more difficult world out there does mean potential for hard landing. But the key I will keep looking at with the US economy is the strength of the labour market and the immigration. Actually, they have a huge amount of immigration into the US, and that seems to be getting them into this sort of Goldilocks scenario where they manage to add a bit of growth. Inflation's coming off, but jobs are being also added. So if that persists in the US, it might not be so bad. What do you think? You're hard landing all the way?
Well, I think it's a hard landing seems likely just because of the lag effect. So I think that the market is probably underestimating the extent to which there's still a lot of catching up from all the rate hikes that are already in the system. So I think that's part of it. I think we heard from one of the Bank of England members talking about maybe 50% of rate hikes have so far actually been felt. I think as well, there's a lot of risks from the market, from the financial stability point of view, with the amount of issuance, amount of borrowing by governments. I think the sort of rising fiscal deficits is one of the key themes as well that we're exploring.
It's astonishing, really, isn't it? Because as we sit here now recording this, I would say that the rise in markets, the fall in volatility, a lot of that was kicked off by this issuance announcement, wasn't it, of a few weeks back, which like everyone was like, oh, it's not as high as expected. It's still huge, like you say, right? Mm-hmm. It's still a massive amount to be digested. So, it's funny about lags, isn't it? Because I wonder if we were not in this sort of 24/7 social media world, we would have had a bit more patience, as you say, just to wait for it to feed through. I mean, that's quite frightening when you say only half, perhaps, of the rate hikes have actually manifested. So, I think I would say I'm probably more optimistic than you, but do not deny that there's still tightening in the system. We haven't quite seen the whites of the eyes yet.
No, not yet. And I think it goes to the sort of point of the last mile. So we heard a lot about that from central banks last year and from the Bank for International Settlements, the sort of central bank of central banks, if you like, or the sort of regulator for central banks. And this last mile on inflation being the hardest bit.
Yeah.
That seems to be the consensus. And I think the market seems to be assuming maybe a bit more disinflation is coming. We have seen quite a fair bit of disinflation this year. We've gone from 10% to 4%, roughly. Say, the Eurozone inflation was down to 2.9%. So there has been disinflation, but it's getting it down to 2%, and that's although they are, central banks are saying we're still aiming for 2%. I think there comes a point at which they're going to have to accept that it's going to have to be higher, and that whether or not they do that explicitly or tacitly is going to have big implications for the market.
Yeah, what do you think on that? You mean that they might explicitly change inflation targets and admit they're not getting there?
I think that is coming. I think at the moment, though, they dare not say that, because that would allow the genie out of the bottle. I think Jay Powell, we note it in the outlook. Jay Powell in a press conference or speaking to the Senate subcommittee, saying, if you think inflation is going to be 5%, that's what it becomes. It's very driven by expectations, and consumer inflation expectations remain stubbornly high. I think Conference Board was up about 6% for 1 year ahead expectations recently. So consumers are still think inflation's coming, even though inflation's actually coming down. So there's a mismatch there. There's also the mismatch in terms of how people feel about their economic situation versus the reality, and that's to do with inflation as well. So I think that getting that last mile will be the toughest, and that maybe has an implication for where the market is in terms of pricing in cuts next year. So at the moment, the market's pricing in a lot of cuts next year, but maybe they're maybe being a little bit premature. So I don't know if you would agree with that.
I do agree with that. I think that the last mile is going to be tricky, if only because actually for quite some time to come, we will be volatile with inflation. So this is the thing I think is underappreciated. The shocks, and in fact, we've had several: pandemic, war, inflation itself, political dislocations, all of those shocks. It's only actually been, it'll be 4 years next March since the pandemic. And that maybe feels a long time. It's not a long time in economic land. No. So I could see a scenario, let's roll forward even further than next year. Let's go to 2030, a decade on. We look back and say, we really jumped around a lot. Inflation went up to 10, down to 3, up to 6, down to 1. And on average, it was probably 3 to 4% rather than 1 to 2%. But what's very hard for a central bank is, how do you look through that? You're supposed to set policy for the long term, which is why it's definitely the key to think is higher for longer. I mean, high for longer, whether or not they're going any higher or not. So I think that I agree about the last mile, but the focus of markets on when is the cut coming, when are the cuts coming. I mean, even if inflation gets to 2%, but you've got those inflation expectations at 3, 4, 5%, they can't cut in that scenario. Cutting is when you're at 1% and growth is falling and unemployment's hugely high and there's a recession.
And unemployment, as you say, is still incredibly low.
Yeah,
and that's key.
So absolutely.
The structural change in the labour market is key.
So I think I actually think it'll be a nasty surprise that for the market, the big nasty surprise will be those cuts aren't coming. Yeah, they're just not coming.
So no cuts next year. Not even a trim to keep, to keep policy as restrictive as it currently is now. And of course, we're speaking now in December. This is prior to the Fed's December meeting.
Yes.
So some possible changes might have taken place at that meeting in terms of the dot plot and so on. Yes. But roughly speaking, we think that the market's pricing in quite a lot of cuts next year. More measured, maybe commentators are suggesting that they just trim it. So to maintain policy as restrictive as it is now. And then some people are saying absolutely no cuts next year.
I say none, because it'll be too late by the time it comes. If we are in that recessionary dynamic, you're talking about the harder landing, it's already beginning now. We may not see it manifest. I don't know if you want to put a timer on it, but it's within the next 12 months, if not maybe the next 6 months. So given we've talked about the monetary policy lag, the only thing I could see them cutting for in the US would be a real financial stability wobble, a really significant one to flood the system with liquidity, as we know they like to do. And I like to go back to sort of that 1994 episode where there were huge rate hikes back then as well. They stayed up at those levels pretty much until 2001. There was a trim, though. I think maybe it was 50 to 75 basis points of cuts that came from the peak. But if you think, what's that? 7 years, 7 years of relatively high interest rates before they really slashed them. This obsession with pricing in lots of cuts seems totally wrong to me.
Yeah, I think probably the cuts come if there is a major recession, if it's a full,
but we're a full blown,
the full blown crash. Which is, although I think there's a slight, the semantics of hard landing, soft landing, threading the needle, and so on. These are all kind of nice ways of putting things, but essentially a slowdown next year doesn't necessarily mean they cut rates, because ultimately unemployment remains very low, inflation remains sticky. You're not going to see that 1% level of inflation, and
there is growth in the US economy.
There is
some growth.
Right. Different elsewhere, maybe. China. We don't want to get too far into the weeds in terms of China.
But one thing I want to say about is actually about the business cycle. So this is I think the obsession with recession and inflation has come from just decades of us feeling like it's a nice smooth curve. You can see when you're on the way up, then you fall down, then you bottom out and you turn back up. We are not in that world. Since March 2020, that is gone.
Yeah.
Even without a war in Europe and a war in the Middle East and everything else that's going on. So I keep waiting for the market to wake up to this when it tries to it sort of prices in this business cycle, and it just
it's
isn't
not
there.
The same thing.
It's just not there.
I think that goes to one of our chapters in our books about war is inflationary. Fundamentally, we're dealing with more conflict. Jamie Dimon saying that this is possibly the most unstable time for the world in decades, and
probably in our lifetimes. I mean,
for sure.
We're both only 21, obviously. But in our few, even in our few decades, it's it is going back to our childhood. In fact,
yes,
it's going back to a world before communism was defeated and everyone embraced liberal democracy and China came on board and it was all delightful. But that sort of 25-year period is more the historical anomaly.
Yes,
we're far more used to a world of conflict. Multipolarity.
Yeah. And I sort of see it as the sort of period sort of just before the First World War when we had the end of the liberal free trade kind of ideal, and you saw the rise of more sort of mercantilism, and that's kind of what we're seeing now. Other what's the word?
Corollaries.
I can't say that word. Corollaries. Yeah. Correlation.
Historical parallels.
Balkanization, wars in proxy wars being fought, political assassinations, and so on. So, not to sound too much of a pessimist, but those are the
it's a realist.
The kind of world.
I think that's it.
The kind of analogy.
I mentioned that point of historical context because if we extrapolate from what was a very calm period, we will all draw the wrong conclusions. And I suppose to put my philosophy hat on, for those of you who read Thomas Hobbes, his view of man was it's a nasty, brutal and short life, and we are predisposed to conflict. So I don't think that's pessimistic as much as just realistic, and I would think people can spot that's going on. I think the QE in financial markets hasn't helped though. That's been like this.
Yeah.
What is it now? God, 15 years really on and off we've had it, and that's almost like a drug.
And as we saw with the banking crisis in March, the Fed's instant reaction function was basically to turn it back on. Yeah, that was the key.
Yeah. That's what saved this year, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it has been a good year. Well, as we're speaking now, anyway, it's been, I think, one of the fourth best month for the S&P since in 10 years. So
amazing.
10% rally, 10% rally. Yeah. So really good November, and that change happened, as you said, with that the Treasury issuance, and it came in the same sort of week. The ECB, the central banks are very good at doing this, doing things together, so that no one seems too far out of step, except maybe the RBA occasionally or whatever. But the ECB, the Bank of England, and the Fed tend to move quite similarly, and we saw that pause in sort of late October, early November. So we've probably talked about central banks a lot. That's probably enough. Although maybe the Bank of Japan is maybe one last one.
Well, I would keep an eye on that, because
it's
especially when this will go out to everyone, because there has been something of a historical interest from the Japanese to do things around Christmas time. It's obviously not a holiday there, Christmas Day.
Oh, right, is it not?
I don't believe.
It's not.
Yeah, if you really get sick of your family on Christmas Day,
Go to Japan.
go and have a look at the Nikkei. But they're clearly gearing up for a final shift away from negative interest rates and yield curve control. That's extremely significant, and we've already seen some of the moves start to filter into other markets, haven't we? Yeah. So I actually think that this is one that is possibly something that's going to kick in the next 2 or 3 months, from the way the Bank of Japan are talking. That they would keep wanting to make these little shifts. So obviously when they make the really big one...
Very tentative though so far, haven't they?
Well, you say that for maybe compared to other central banks, but for them, I've been quite surprised at the audacity of it. Because actually, this is a country that spent, well, it was supposed to be a lost decade. It's been 3 lost decades now since the bubble burst, at the 80s, 90s bubble burst. And for my whole lifetime, this was my trading lifetime, when I started out on the trading floor 22 years ago. I mean, Japan were just, original architects of QE, 0 interest rates, huge debt, kind of very stagnant kind of an economy, and could never ever get inflation, never get it, and now they have it.
10 years of Abenomics finally.
It got there. Well, and
the third arrow maybe is it?
The third arrow got shot into the air, and then the COVID pandemic probably sent it.
And there's been some real sort of movements with some of the unions, I think steelworkers and so on. So the pay the politicians are trying to drive up the pay.
They are.
So there's a concerted effort there that seems likely to result in exit of ZERP. Basically. Yes,
and actually increased female participation in their labour force is worth noting. Although Ueda, the Bank of Japan governor, has been saying that may well have reached its peak, and again that would tend towards being inflationary, because you've brought a lot more people into the labour force.
And they like to spend.
You have to cut that bit out.
Mrs. Watanabe.
Mrs. Watanabe.
Oh, let's talk about Mrs. Watanabe.
She does trade. She does trade. But I think that will have pretty far-reaching ramifications for the rest of the market, because Japan, this huge saving economy that deployed money overseas.
Yeah. And it's all going to be repatriated.
Exactly. I mean, I think the trade of next year, stick my neck out here, is you look at dollar yen. Am I allowed to mention this? It's not. Okay. Let me rephrase it.
Disclaimers
on whether let's just say that the yen has been structurally weak for a long time, for good macroeconomic reasons. But now, with what we're looking at about a huge change in their interest rate regime, repatriation of funds, you could well imagine that the yen will have a lot more strength. And so, dollar yen does, when it moves, it really moves.
It does. And we saw it move a lot to 150, didn't we, this year? So
exactly. So I actually think watching dollar yen will be quite a useful indicator of kind of global liquidity and a reversal of flows. Yeah. So I think it'll be at least something to keep an eye on if it does make its way back down to 120 or something like that. I'll just put it out there as a
hard target on there. Okay, cool. And then, so the other great thing that's going to be happening next year, I say great, I mean exciting, potentially earth-shattering thing, is the US election.
Yes.
Which is probably the big ticket one. We maybe have a UK election.
Yes.
Probably, although you could wait until 2025. And we, of course, have the European parliamentary elections as well. So lots happening, but US election is the big one. I think Trump's going to win. I put my neck on the line there.
I think so too, although I will caveat that we do run a huge piece of analysis and we haven't done that yet, so let's see what comes out. But I'll tell you what I think it comes down to is literally quite a small group of swing voters. We've got our eye on Nevada, because Nevada was a really interesting Senate race 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It was a very 50-50 one. It went Democrat, which was really helped Biden because he, got more control of the Senate. We actually thought it would be Republican. So it's interesting to see if that will hold. Has Biden held some of his natural supporters there? Because obviously the thing with Nevada is hugely affected by the pandemic because of the large hospitality industry. Demographic change. So Reno, apparently some of Tesla's moved in there, so that the workforce is shifting. Massive Hispanic vote, but then you see with the Senate race, it was interesting because they had a Latina senator, so there was maybe an element there that maybe dominated. But you'd think that Trump would want to win those kinds of voters in that sort of...
And the Hispanic vote not necessarily quite as obviously maybe pro-Democrat as you might think.
Absolutely not.
That sort of Christian element as well.
There's that. There's the fact that, again, we're very painting broad brushstrokes, but, the Hispanic vote in Florida tends to hate socialism for its Cuban links. So there's a lot going on. But it's for sure that it's going to come down to, I think, quite a small group of swing voters.
Yeah. And the implications, of course, if Trump were to win. I mean, we're assuming it's Trump versus Biden.
Well, we are, aren't we?
We get this sort of New Hampshire primary quite early, 2024, and then by about March, I think we know roughly who's going to be contesting it.
I think we are 99% correct to say this because momentum is so important in US politics. It's this machine. Basically, day one that you get in, you have to start campaigning for 4 years' time for your re-election. And frankly, neither party has managed to shake off either of the octogenarians or whatever, septuagenarian, whatever trumpet, but the old guys who've been doing it a while.
And the economy matters, of course, for the voters. And there's been a lot about the sort of doom and gloom that people feel versus
the reality of what's in their pocket.
Yeah, and see certain economists, Paul Krugman, and Miss Sam, I forget her first name, very keen.
Claudia Sam.
Claudia Sam.
Yeah, the former Fed economist. Yeah.
So they're keen to point out, people are nominally better off, but of course they don't feel better off because inflation's eaten into it. There's been lots of change and so on.
Yeah, a lot of worries and concerns about what the future holds.
Yeah, and who's going to be taking the jobs and so on. Although the unemployment rate is incredibly
We haven't even mentioned AI, Neil. We got all the way through.
I've avoided that.
I'm not surprised.
That's a minefield that I think that's for another day. We'll keep that one for another day or another year, maybe, when we know a bit more about it. Yes. But it's obviously, AI is having a huge impact.
Well, yeah. No, but it's
wrong to dismiss it.
No, but at this stage, it's clearly got, in market parlance, it's got a real FOMO about it. Yeah. Whatever the reality of it. People just excited. In fact, us saying the words AI, we're going to get extra hits. Anyway, yeah. So what are they actually going to herald? I think that's a more interesting question. What would actually be the difference between them? It's going to depend, again, on the Senate votes to see if that switches hands. Yeah. I think there's every chance it's still quite a split government and they may not be able to do all that much, but that may not be a bad thing.
No, and you do a lot of analysis on the sort of the actual mechanics, the granular detail of which seats are being contested this year versus the other years, and therefore what the likelihoods of different permutations. So, and that will be something that you'll be looking at next year, I assume.
For sure. Yeah. But it's always extremely hard to get policies passed in America. That's the point of the separation of powers. The thing that works well then is that it allows the economy to kind of go under its own steam. So the tech giants kind of just keep rolling on, don't they? So I think that always gives me reason to be optimistic about America. It's just the most dynamic, flexible economy in the world. So in a way, whoever's in the White House, it matters probably more for foreign policy, which is maybe something you want to mention.
Yeah, well, certainly something that we talk about in the Watchlist is the implications of if Trump were to come back, what might happen. There is some economic implications there, potentially the Inflation Reduction Act. Talk about rolling back lots of that. But I think the key thing will be Ukraine, Israel, China. I mean,
Yeah.
those are the three sort of
Well,
things in the foreign
and or
policy stakes.
anything else that pops
And
up.
anything else.
South America.
Well, there's
Maybe.
a new staunch ally in
New man
Argentina.
in Argentina.
Yeah, so there's lots of things happening there. I don't know. I don't see particularly whether Trump or Biden win, or Democrat or Republican. There seems to be consensus in Congress and in Washington that's sort of quite antagonistic to China now. So maintaining,
yes, I think that's right.
Maintaining a sort of a new China policy that Donald Trump really brought in, and Biden's built on, with the chip restrictions and all that kind of thing. So
we'll probably see more of that, right? And
whoever it is, it's going to be leading in one direction. I think in the watch list, I mentioned a Gallup survey from March. So things might have changed a bit, but just 15% of voters in the US holding a sort of favourable opinion of China. So there's no differentiation between. There's no positive for them campaigning on a pro-China kind of ticket. So I think that America first is probably what we're going to get either way.
Yeah, I think the Middle East is going to be the more moving the dial on consuming foreign policy and defence resources. I mean, one thing we can be sure of is that defence spending is going to go up.
Yeah,
everywhere.
I think that ties into the sort of theme that that in the watch list is conflict. It's whether it's conflict between ideas or actual conflict. It's more conflict, more mercantilism, more deglobalization, so more spending, and deficits,
more inflationary,
and more inflation.
We began. That has to be that kind of a world. It's got more inflationary elements to it. Yeah, I would just pick up on this about the fractured nature of our politics. It makes domestic policy making much harder. Look at Germany. They've had their first ever three-party coalition. They're polling in the doldrums. There are constitutional issues now with the debt break. I mean, it's mayhem. The Netherlands, coalition falls apart over immigration issues, and now we see a strong anti-immigrant party under Geert Wilders coming top in that election, right? Yeah. France, I saw Marine Le Pen was beating Macron on a poll about 6 months ago.
Yeah, her polling's doing remarkably
and of course,
well.
you do have Meloni already in Italy, and what's happening there. So, and that's that's Europe. So what that means is getting anything done domestically is really hard. So the energy you have for doing things overseas is even you've not got it. You've not got the money. The time, the resources, the political capital, because you're using all your political capital to get things done at home, or just to actually govern at home, not even to make changes. Yeah. So what we see in the UK on this, with a kind of stagnation politically, is now I am pessimistic about this. That is reflected across the Western world. We just have to go through it. We'll have the elections. There will be big changes, and we'll be in a better world in the future. But I think sort of political stagnation is a theme in a way for the year ahead on that front.
And so it's interesting if there's lots of splits, essentially more nationalism within Europe. It's arguably these sort of foreign policy catastrophes on their doorsteps that are maybe holding things together, arguably. So, a few years ago we might have said that a situation like Ukraine could split the European Union, whereas actually it's unifying. It's helping to unify and helping to keep, say, some of them, potentially people that might drift off, maybe more within the core. So that'd be an interesting one to.
Yeah, that's a good theme to think more about. I will mention about the conflict in the Middle East, by the way. Oil prices, to me, surprisingly subdued on the back of all of this, because there have been shipping tankers targeted in the Red Sea through this. Could well see more of that. I mean, that conflict isn't going away.
No, but I guess the arguments really quite maybe doesn't matter, or can be discounted by and large, is simply that it's always been there. It's not a new.
You mean the conflict?
The conflict's not really new. I mean, I know the threat of escalation is new, maybe, but in a sense, it's sort of
No,
always
but
been there.
but this is where, after a pandemic where governments have spent so much, got so much debt on their books, interest rates are now a lot higher than they were. Their fiscal capacity to help is tapped out. Not to mention what we've just discussed, their political ability to do so. So I think, yes, in a sense, but no, because we should look at the world as a group of nations really struggling, and then any more shocks, it's going to be really hard to deal with that.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think that Western governments have spent a lot of their political capital on their populations, their native populations, if you like. They're losing that capital. They've spent a lot of it already, and trust is. I think it's something that you actually wrote about for us last year, was the ungovernment idea of sort of, and that sort of taps into that kind of theme as well. So so Europe's a bit of a mess, basically, and the UK is probably not any better. But we do have probably an election, and
in the
almost
UK, most likely we will have one next year. But there's two risks. One is the economy struggles, and the Prime Minister just can't quite ever bring himself to call the election, and it runs out, and then we go to January 2025. That's when it has to be held by. We could see that, I think, based on the economy.
Low turnout, I guess. Middle of January.
Yeah, exactly. But the other element is actually it all falls apart much sooner. There's a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister, lots of internal enemies. He's made a lot of enemies. We've done a lot of analysis. We have something called the Rishi ratings, which you can. We did quantitative analysis of each Conservative MP. He does struggle with keeping together his own party. You might not believe it, but there are some, of course, who would like to change Prime Minister again, because obviously
who would we pick this time, do you think?
Well, there's still the same sorts of front runners, Penny Mordaunt, Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman obviously fancies it. But there is also, Lord Cameron is back. Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton.
Well, as we talk about in the watch list, at the very first sentence, I think I mentioned.
Oh, yes.
The reappearance of David Cameron is certainly not something we had on our bingo cards for 2023.
Well, exactly. So how about this? Rishi Sunak steps down, David Cameron becomes caretaker Prime Minister, and then we get an election.
With a Labour win, I assume?
With a Labour win, but they are coming from their worst result ever, almost, since the 1930s anyway. Yeah. So the problem they have is they do need that Tony Blair 1997 style number of seats just to get a majority of one.
And not a Neil Kinnock style 1992 snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
Yes. Yeah. And I should throw in a few things here. This is for the real geeks. Constituencies are being redrawn, the boundaries are redrawn, so it's more unpredictable. Lots of people are fed up.
That's in favour of the Tories, I believe.
Marginally. Lots of people do not want to be bothered to vote. They've had enough of everyone. And
well, again, this is multipolarity, fragmentation. That's the theme of the whole thing, is fragmenting votes. So you can't call necessarily on the same cohorts, dependable, rock-solid Labour voters, Tory voters, and so on. And so you get greater fragmentation, which...
Greater uncertainty about the results.
It makes polling harder, makes expectations harder, and potentially makes it harder for one party to form a government. Although, of course, it can because of the first past the post system.
It can, which it sure does help. But as I say, because Labour are coming from such a low number of absolute seats, and the Conservatives have quite a high number of absolute seats, the number has to change hands quite dramatically. I would say that Labour's biggest gain is probably Scotland. They can be pretty sure of more than their solitary one MP at the moment. Well,
that's going to swing massively.
So that will help them get to a majority for sure.
And that means, just sort of to round off the conversation about the UK anyway, for the UK, for the market, for gilts, for pound, Labour generally less pro-city, but at the same time, we get maybe more growth. Maybe we get more industrial strategy.
Rachel Reeves and her team have really embraced business in the city and made a lot more contact. I don't think a lot will change.
And we can get any more high tax than we are now anyway.
No, I think there will be... And remember, they haven't been in government for a long time, so it'll take them a bit of time to find the levers of power.
And the skeletons.
And the skeletons, yes. And then the jostling begins on their side as to who will succeed Keir Starmer, because some people will be thinking of that already. Yep. So, yeah, I think there's nothing at all to fear from a Labour government, and actually quite a lot to consider positive, just from virtue of a new group coming in and wanting to get things done. But it will be whether they actually have the numbers, because there are a broad church on the left as well. So there will be, people on the left-hand side of that party who are also quite discontented, like the right wing of the Tory party is. So they will be hard for them to govern, as we've said. So I think, in a way, I don't think it's the election that should necessarily wobble UK assets. I think it's, can the Prime Minister survive until the election? That's the risk premium there. After the election, far less to worry about.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good year.